Hi guys, and welcome to week 4 of Debates About Debates. And week 4 we're going to look at a not so common nowadays, but I think very interesting, very challenging type of debate, and one that if you can master will teach you how to do many other types of debates, right? Because it is essentially fundamentally about comparisons. And while all debates are about comparisons and comparing two different arguments, the two policies, the two paradigms, the two worldviews, these debates are essentially just about comparisons, and they force you to compare. Hence, debates about comparisons, right? So for example, you will know it's a comparison debate when you see comparative words like more harm than good, right? So it's not saying let's solve this problem, let's ban this, let's do this, let's withdraw, let's regret, whatever. It just says we believe that X causes more harm than good than Y, or X is better than Y, right? That X is more than. As long as you see a word then, that is definitely a debate about comparison, right? Or words like prioritize. This house would prioritize this over that. That again is a comparison, right? So you need to say why we would do one over the other, why one is better than the other, or how one thing is compared to the other, right? So you're comparing apples and oranges. That's exactly what you need to do, compare two things that are different. So it doesn't make sense to compare oranges and oranges or apples and apples because they're the same. Anyway, so essentially debates about comparisons, okay? So now what's really tricky in this debate is defining the standards in which you're going to compare. Because here, you're not required to do something, right? You're not required to solve a problem. You can talk about why there is a problem in society, and given that problem, this thing is more important than that thing. So implicitly, you are saying we need to prioritize in order to resolve something else. And, or given the context in society, this is more important than that, right? But whether or not you win or lose the debate isn't tied to your solvency, your need, whether you're actually solving that problem, right? It's more like I have an opportunity to choose these two things, and these two things are comparable to each other. Now, why is this thing better than this thing, right? Why are iPhones better than Samsung phones? iOS better than Android? Google compared to Apple? I know those are all very techie comparisons, but I think you hopefully will get the picture there, right? So the most important thing is to define the standards. Where I read that. The standard of comparison. How will you compare? How will you say, how will you measure more than or better than, right? So for example, boys are better than girls, okay? So what is better than? And how will I compare better than, okay? Now what's important here is your standards cannot be absolute, right? Absolute or tautological, descriptive kind of standards. It needs to be standards that can be applied on both things equally, on both sides equally, right? And standards that can maybe even be applied in other contexts, right? So because you can't define them in a way that is tautological, right? So if I say that tall is better than short, and I say better than means length and height, therefore by definition, tall is better than short. Ta-da! That's not debatable. Your standard will be rejected. Okay, so the standards can't be absolute standards. It can't be tautological standards, right? Secondly, the standards need to be fair as much as possible and objective. Because you don't want to have a debate about standards. Having a debate about standards is like a definitional debate. And maybe Op can challenge the standards and discuss them and add standards if standards are missing. But if the entire debate is about two teams proposing self-serving standards on each other, then the debate doesn't necessarily happen, right? On that day, debate loses. And you don't want to make debate lose, because everyone has a terrible time. You have a terrible time, judges have a terrible time, the world has a terrible time, right? And that's definitely bad. So try to include standards that are objective. And if you can do that, that gives you control over the debate. Okay? And so some part of your speech and case is almost like showing why these standards are good to be used to evaluate these two things, right? So if I'm comparing, iPhones and Samsung phones or Android phones, I can say like, okay, I take very generic standards. I say like ease of use, that's one standard. Value for money, right? So I'm not saying absolute price, because maybe an absolute price, one will be cheaper than the other, although that's also debatable, right? You can show that maybe if just because it's cheaper doesn't mean it's always better. But if I say value for money, then I need to, it's a more open and objective kind of standard, right? So ease of use, value for money, and security there. Very open, very broad, applicable standards. No one's going to contest the standards. And the standards can be then used to measure these things, okay? So standards can be used to measure. So once I provide the standards, I show you how they can be used. And argue around that standard. So pretty much I provided the argument, right? So if I say apples and iPhones, and we're going to talk about ease of use. So how can I define ease of use? What does ease of use mean? And then show how maybe one is more easy to use compared to the other, right? Inevitably, the debate will also come down to stakeholders. Because when you say ease of use for who? Ease of use for young people, old people, ease of use for people who are more technologically oriented, people who are not technologically oriented. I don't know, right? Either one. So again, using different standards, you need to break down those standards, talk about how those standards can be measured, and then talk about how those standards apply to your context, right? To your individuals, to your stakeholders, to your situation. And that will then pretty much set up the basis for your entire debate, right? And these things, like your stakeholders and the measurability of the standards, will then be things that you use to break the deadlock. You'll get a little bit clearer when I run through a few examples, but I really want to kind of lay this out right now first, right? So pretty much, first thing, ensure the standards are fair, right? Not absolute, tautological, fair and objective standards. Standards that if you were on the other side, you would accept. Standards that you think the judges would accept. Standards that you can use in other debates. So these will be quite generic, general types of standards, right? Like categories for clashes. That's quite a good way to think about it, actually. Secondly, ensure that they can be measured, and talk about how they can be measured, right? So if I say one standard is value to the economy, what do I mean by that? Do I mean it leads more, creates more jobs, increases GDP? How is it value to the economy? That's the standard, right? Thirdly, think about the stakeholders and the context in which this debate will be applied. Okay, so talk about the situation, talk about the problem if there's a problem, and talk about who you are talking about. And again, don't only focus on the people who helps you the most, right? But try to be as broad and generic as possible. Well, although you don't have to talk about the entire world, right? So you can break it down, use that to help your argumentation, and use that to resolve clashes. El Brillante. Now let's look at slightly more detailed chart. Okay. So firstly, in the approach, like we mentioned earlier, clearly establish standards and the context for the comparison. What am I talking about? Who am I talking about? What is the situation? What type of society, etc., etc. Right? It's not about solving a problem, evaluating two options. So you have to clearly also sometimes define those two options, right? And lay it out and say, this is about comparing these two options. This is option one. This is option two. Let's compare, right? And how are we going to compare? This is how we're going to compare, okay? Define the standards and as well as the comparative words. Ensure your standards are fair and not self-serving, okay? Done. On op, what do you do on op? Now, Op needs to take a position on the standards. Now these debates can actually be very, very clear. If the sides choose really good standards and they agree, then the clashes are actually set up from the start. So all you do is just kind of compare, right? You focus on argumentation, you focus on the measurements, and then you give analysis and arguments to show why the measurement means you win or the measurement means they lose, right? But op has a responsibility to accept, refine those standards. If op challenges the standards, op needs to provide new ones. I think it's good as much as possible to find resolution on standards as quickly as possible, right? Because if you don't, then that becomes a definitional debate, right? And you don't want to just put self-serving standards. Then they'll say like, maybe those standards apply in your context, but for the broader debate, I agree with this other team who provided much more general, better standards. Okay, so in terms of the strategy for different teams, there isn't really, I think, that much of a difference in this debate, right? The challenge in this debate is identifying those standards and then looking at ways to approach them and use them for your side. So the same thing approaches in terms of the arguments. Show why the standards are best, show why they're fair, how they make the comparison, and then discuss stakeholders. Same thing on opposition. I think it's good if the standards are acceptable, use the proposition standards, but show why it makes more sense under your case. If you can do that, then you are using their tools, their measurement tools, to show why, even according to their tools, your option works out better, right? So take their scale and then use it. You may need to adjust and modify it a little bit, but if you can do that, then you avoid the whole messiness about arguing about standards. But it's also quite strategic because they can't deny the standards because they provided those standards, right? So that's what I think the best op approach is in the situation. If the debates, the standards are clearly set, that's what the clashes will become on, the standards set by the debate. You can use additional standards to evaluate the clashes. So this is what I was saying earlier about stakeholders, right? So cost effective, but cost effective for who? It's easy to use for who? And what is the context which is it easy to use? How are we evaluating these things in terms of the measurement? Is it evaluated in the short term? Is it evaluated in the long term? Is it evaluated in terms of for this minorities or for everybody in society? How are we doing that evaluation? And if we evaluate it from this perspective, it's better for us. Then you have to justify why we should evaluate it from this perspective, not from the other perspective, right? So you see what I mean? I accept the standard of ease of use, but I think it needs to be evaluated based on ease of use after using it for a little while. Okay, not immediate ease of use because you're going to use it for a long term after this, or ease of use based on ease of use of children, or ease of use of people in the first world, or the second world, or third world, or fourth world, or fifth world, or however it is. But that's the strategy that I think you should use eventually to break apart the clashes. Okay, that's pretty much I think the overview because there's not that much strategic differences on either side. So let's go into examples, right? And I think in the examples, we will see a clearer picture. Let's change the color and take a drink. So first debate. This house believes that raising cigarette prices do more harm than good. Should that be does more harm than good? Maybe. Anyway, you get the point. So the tricky part here is the more harm than good. As usual, try to do this on your own first. All right. Pause this video, walk through, and what you really need to work through here is what standards you're going to use. Okay, so what are the standards? How are you going to measure these standards? Right? Who are the stakeholders? And what are some arguments? Okay, should take a little while and prep those things first, and then we can compare. And waiting. Okay, done. Excellent. So this house believes that raising cigarette prices do more harm than good. What kind of standards can we set? So I think we should take a big picture, look at society, right, and evaluate, do more harm than good for society. And when we look at that, we can talk about harm in sense of the economy, right? I'm just putting stuff on the top of my head here. We can refine it later. Say for the individual, smokers and non-smokers. What else? The individual's family, there will be a subset of the individual maybe, or the environments, maybe hard to put that in there. Or maybe we can split up the consumers, the economy, something. We have these two standards. What would be a good third one? We can break the, well, no, let's say companies. Right? Companies that make tobacco, although that's kind of part of the economy. So is it possible to just have two? I don't really need to have three, maybe. Yeah, I guess it's possible. Right? You narrow the debate a little bit. Let's try it. Let's say the economy, and under the economy we could talk about companies, and under individuals we could talk about smokers and non-smokers, right? And that's quite comprehensive. If you set up the standards like that, I think it's hard for the other side to say that, no, I think your standards are unfair, right? So how would we measure that? So we say whether companies would make more money or lose more money, right? Whether or not more jobs or less jobs will be created. Okay, that's going to be our assessment of the economy. In terms of individuals, we have the smokers and non-smokers. Okay, and whether they will be happier and healthier. Okay, good. So those are the standards. I spent some time talking about them. In this debate, I don't really need to explain, I think, raising cigarette prices that much. This is a Korean context when cigarette prices were doubled at the start of this year, but it's something that can apply in many other debates. If that earlier part, if it's not clear, then you may need to define it. But in this case, I think that's really clear. So put down those standards. So I've already talked about standards, how to measure them, and in a way talked about stakeholders because I've mentioned the companies and smokers and non-smokers, right? Now you can just make arguments and build it. So in terms of the economy, raising cigarette prices, I think, discourages consumption. Consumption is good. It increases tax. People, maybe smokers will still end up buying cigarettes, end up spending a lot of money, or they'll have to shift their consumption to other things if they're really, really addicted, right? And that's why it's bad. Cigarette companies are affected. People who manufacture cigarettes are affected. All those different harms in terms of the economy, right? On the gov side. Okay, so harms consumption, less money, companies lose money, etc., right? So on op, it's hard for you to argue that maybe lowering cigarette consumption is a bad thing because that's the goal of this policy. It's a bit hard on gov to say that we want people to smoke, but we say that individual liberties will pick that part up later. But the impact on the tobacco industry and maybe the impact on industries that depend on the tobacco industry is going to be a bit negative. On op, I can concede part of that, right? So you will say that part of this is true, but it's not that bad, right? It's not like the whole economy is crashing because the prices of cigarettes went up. In fact, there are savings for the economy because we save on health-related costs, right? So what I'm trying to do here is try to find a different way to approach that standard, right? The standard of the economy and jobs and stuff, but without really challenging the standard, right? So I'm not going to say, hey, it's unfair to look at the economy because we think we should accept some kind of economic loss because we want to improve the health of people. So your standard is unfair, right? Instead, I'll say let's look at the economy. You're looking at the very short term. I'm going to look at a very long term approach to the economy. I'll take into account the health of people, and I'll say even in the short term, there'll be maybe a small blip, right? But in the long term, is much better. Maybe a little bit of smuggling and stuff, but in the long term, much better. Okay, so that's going to be the back and forth on the economy, on whether or not it helps to raise these prices, not raise these prices, so on and so forth. Now, the Gov team doesn't need to propose a solution, right? But you can take a position. You can say, we think it's bad for people to smoke, and we're going to discourage people to smoke through other ways. We just think this way is bad, and that's why it's doing more harm than good. Okay? You can also argue that it doesn't really work. So maybe we have another comparator here in terms of its impact. So it does more harm because it doesn't actually work. It fails to achieve its goals. Or we can get to that over here in the second standard. Right? So in the second standard, you say it doesn't work. It's harmful because firstly it fails. People still smoke. They just end up spending more money to smoke. People feel more victimized. People feel justified now smoking because they paid taxes. So they're like, hey, I'm paying more for this privilege, right? Don't harass me, right? Secondhand smokers still suffer because you lose the political will you need to ban smoking in public places, for example, maybe, or at least that's how you argue. That would be, that's a more effective policy to reduce, to mitigate harm. That individuals harm themselves, focus on the harm that are being caused to other people, right? Maybe. So that's your breakdown in terms of how it's bad for the individual. It's bad for individual rights. That's fails, not fruits. Okay, so it's bad for individual rights. It fails to lower the harm, right? Because other policies are better. We shouldn't have done this. If people still end up buying more and more expensive cigarettes and end up spending money, or save money buying cheaper cigarettes and then harm their health still. So that's all still really pretty bad, right? On the opposite side, you take the flip side and say, no, of course not. That's ridiculous. It works. It discourages smokers, right? They quit, or it's less likely that they start smoking in the first place because it's really expensive. And we can use the tax money to have more campaigns, to deal with health problems, etc., etc. So it's good for the individual, good for secondhand smokers, good, hopefully won't be smoking secondhand anymore, and good for those first-hand smokers who hopefully will quit. Right? But that's pretty much it. So at the end of the day, the debate will come down to, you look at those two clashes, which side, what are the impacts to the economy? Are they as severe or not severe? Is it good? Is it bad? And secondly, does this tool actually work? How does it impact the individuals, the smokers, the non-smokers? Does it increase rights, reduce rights, and so on and so forth? The rights part, I guess, will be kind of a strong point on Gov, and the harm part will be the strong point on Op, right? Strategically, the teams can try to take each other's strong points, right? So on Op, argue how these rights deny other people's rights. That would be great. Or on Op, argue how these harms are justified as part of the rights, or in fact increase because of this policy, because you force people to make even more dangerous choices. Okay, but good. That's the debate about raising the prices of cigarettes. Second debate. This house believes in nature over nurture. Now this is a bit complex because there are quite a few unknowns, right? There is over. What is the standard of comparison of over? There is nature. There is nurture. So this is a very kind of metaphysical debate, which in fact is another category of debates that we can look into, which we will do in the future. But we'll try to approach this here, right? We use what we got from our standards. So unlike the cigarette price debates, earlier I didn't need to define what I meant by cigarette prices. I just needed to define more harm than good. Here I might need to define nature and nurture. Not in the Oxford Dictionary sense, right? That Oxford Dictionary defines nature as things that exist in nature and nurture. No. But to give it a context so that you can use that context for comparison. So what do you think this debate is about? It could be about to the extent humans have control over nature or our environment, right? Whether or not we can change our environment, not rights, but to the extent that we can change, whether we have full power or we don't. But there's limits there, right? I don't think this is a debate about whether we can beat volcanoes, right? Although you may be tempted to do so from Gov. Can we beat global warming? Maybe, maybe not. So I think if you get stuck in the nature, if you focus on the nature part, you're going to get stuck. Instead, I think maybe look at the nurture part of the debate, right? And when you see this phrase is most commonly associated with education, right? Who is responsible for the upbringing of a child? Is it what area is responsible? Is it the genes, the things, the innate abilities in the child, or is it the upbringing, the education, the exposure, all those other things that the child goes through? Which one will actually determine the final outcome, right? So I think that's where the debate needs to happen. And the Gov side needs to talk about why nature is more important. Op side talks about why nurture is more important within the field of education. That's the approach that will have the least surprises, and I think will be the most balanced. Now, from Gov, you may be like, but I don't want to say that if you're born dumb, you have to be dumb, right? And I don't want to say that because that sounds really bad, but more importantly, that's just not true. People can change, people learn, etc., etc., etc. Yes, absolutely correct. I don't think you need to say that. What you need to show is one aspect is going to overwhelm the other aspect, right? So rather than say, we're not condemning individuals to their biological situations, but rather we're taking their biology, a predestination, into account. And we say that there are things in your biology that determine your outcome, right? And it doesn't need to be a 100% determinants. And some people can overcome their biology. But for a large number of people, what we need to do is take into account their biology so that we don't put too much pressure on them, right? So that we don't force people to do things that they may not be biologically suited to do. Now, this is not saying that we should test everybody and if your IQ is below a certain amount, we kick you out, right? No point doing things, no. But it is saying that if you have a talent, if you have a gift, then we should help encourage you to fulfill your potential in that area. It's saying that not everybody needs to be excellent in math, and not everybody needs to be science students, not everybody needs to be excellent academically, or even excellent academically from one certain perspective. That there should be some diversity in terms of how we approach people, because people have innate preferences, right? So I'm an innate learning style, I have an innate conditioning for something. I have something within me that is kind of that has an impact on my character, right? And it's impossible to say that the biology plays no role, right? So that's the kind of tone I think you should take from the government side. Talk about why biology is important, not the most important thing, but important enough that we shouldn't ignore it, that you can't condition out of it, right? That even if people need to overwhelm it, they are overwhelming it, and for a vast majority of people that doesn't happen. For the vast majority, what we should do is empower their biology, right? To take that into account when we are nurturing them, right? So let's get into a little more detail. So I set the context up as education, talk about education policy or approaches. Okay, so what do we mean by over nurture? So I first need to talk about define the nature and nurture. So I talk about the biology here, and here I talk about teaching approaches, right? So don't be absolute and say, because if you're, it's not about eugenics and like programming people, but it's to take the biology into account when it comes to teaching, and say that some people may have, predisposition for some things over other things. And what the education process needs to do is to help people find their calling, right? On the other side, the argument is that, no, you need to treat everybody the same and not be too quick to judge and encourage, because everybody can do everything. You'd say that, nature is more malleable, and in some extreme situations, maybe, some people are born with more muscle mass, and if you're much taller, you're better at, basketball, but it doesn't mean that others are not. But in the vast majority of areas, it makes almost no difference and is negligible, right? That's the other side, okay? So how do we lay down the over? We've talked about teaching, we talked about how it includes them. So we could talk about, you can talk about a few different contexts to provide those standards, right? So what do you mean by over than others? Talk about the ability to change, maybe to improve or to work one over the other. So to what extent does that biology have an impact on you in terms of your outcome, right? On one side you say it's harder to change, it will always have an influence. The other side says that no, you can change, at least that's what you need to do. Talk about from an education policy approach, right? So what kind of message should be sent, right? So should the message be that you are dumb well, it's a bit harsh, I know, but I'm doing it on purpose, okay? Don't freak out. So the message be that this is your nature and this is how you are, or should the message be that you can be anything that you want to be, right? Obviously, Gov side will reject the narrative that we need to be that hard, that this is exactly how you are and how you need to be. But Gov side will say this will help us teach better, right? This will help us understand where students are coming from. Instead of trying to say that every student is exactly the same, we believe that students are different and we need to teach students differently, okay? Opside says that no, what this will do is encourage students to give up, and instead what you need to do is treat them all like the others, give them all the same opportunity. It doesn't mean you can't have a diversity in teaching approaches, but your final outcomes and expectations should be the same to everyone, okay? So I think that's another kind of big area of clash. Finally, you can talk about how it will impact the children, right, the students, maybe the teachers as well as another stakeholder, if you want to, and say which one of these things are more encouraging to the students, which one makes them feel more comfortable, which one recognizes their potential, their freedom, or which one on the other hand, doesn't, this other stuff, right? Those are the three areas, three comparators I think you can use in this debate. Which will end up being the three clash points, right? And again, it's up to you, right? So if you want to say this is one, I want to make it this is one clash and this is another clash and this is another clash, that's fine. I'm not saying it has to be this, but what you need to do is provide different areas which you can measure. You can say it's going to be more or less for this, this, and this. Because if you don't do that, then you can't compare, and it makes it very difficult to judge the debate. Okay? Last one. This house believes that unions do more harm than good. So we're talking about labor unions. You don't have to pick a specific industry. You can talk about it in general. More harm than good. More harm than good to the economy. So this is more like the first debate, right, on cigarette prices. More harm than good to the economy. More harm than good for the workers themselves, maybe. More harm than good for the company. More harm than good in the short term, long term, although I think that's better for like a dynamic, right? The approach, right? One side will look more short term, one side will go long term, maybe. But these are common standards that you can use, right? So how is it more harm than good for the economy? Although the economy and company here are a little bit related, but you can look at the broader economy. Let's start with workers. More harm than good in workers, what do I mean? I mean defend their rights. Okay, so do unions actually defend their rights or not defend their rights? Do unions give them more freedom? Or do unions force them to follow a line, especially in industries where it's compulsory to join a union? Company, in terms of the profits, in terms of the flexibility of the company, is it more flexible? Is it less flexible? Does it help companies gain more support from their workers if the company has a union, maybe? Right? Can it improve communication if the company has a union, or is it worse if the company doesn't have a union? All those things are better than revolve around the value aid of the company, right? And then maybe these things allow you to take a big picture view on the economy. Does this make the economy more flexible or less flexible, right? Does this encourage the economy to grow or not? Does it make the economy stronger or weaker? Okay, by trying to take a bigger picture, right? Either way, those are your comparators. So Gov side argues that unions harm because it doesn't defend workers' rights, although it seems like it does. It actually forces them to go into a union. It benefits the union leaders, not the union workers, right? They say it's bad for companies because it's not flexible, companies lose money, and it's bad for the economy because unions also have a political impact, right, on the economy, on the nation, or you can have politics as a different outlier, maybe, I don't know, right, and all those things. Opside says, no, it's good for the workers, it defends them, unions are still necessary even though we have legislation. Secondly, that it helps companies. Workers feel more motivated when they feel their rights are protected. You can coordinate worker action through companies that recognize and open to the unions do much better, right? And it helps the economy as a whole because unions help collect social activism. Unions can help make workers more reflective of their community, and the political impact is a positive one, not a negative one. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know, but that is how you compare different things in a debate. Okay? So, as usual, focus on the template, guys. Don't get locked into the debates, right? And if you find a different way to approach these debates, different arguments you can use, great. But in any debate about comparison, one, you must establish those standards, right? Establish standards that are fair, standards that both sides can use, standards that if you were judging, you think would be acceptable, okay? Two, talk about how you can measure those standards. What do you mean by economy or health or whatever, and what are the arguments that fit under there, and how does those arguments push one standard for your side or for the other side, all right? And three, talk about the stakeholders, talk about the different approaches, and you can use those things to show how your standards are more or less measurable, and use those things to break deadlocks, right? Because we focus on this stakeholder, then these two standards need to be evaluated in this way and come to our side. Okay? So, was this video better than the previous video? I don't know. Depends on your standards. Good luck debating debates about comparing things.